Look at the silhouette of this contraption. It doesn't look like a weapon of the 20th century. It looks like a piece of Victorian plumbing that someone accidentally brought to a tank fight. It is a thick, heavy tube of steel with a canvas padding on the buttstock that looks more like a pillow than a recoil pad. There is no rocket motor here, no high-tech guidance, and no muzzle blast. This is the PIAT, the projector infantry anti-tank. It is a weapon that relied on a massive, terrifyingly powerful spring and a prayer to stop 30 tons of German armor. To the uninitiated, the PIAT was a joke. It was heavy, weighing 32 pounds empty and nearly 40 with a bomb loaded. It was awkward to carry, unbalanced, and had a maximum effective range that was essentially close enough to see the color of the enemy's eyes. But to the British and Commonwealth troops who had to face the steel tide of the Wehrmacht, it was often the only thing between them and a shallow grave. It was a weapon of desperation, born from the fact that Britain simply didn't have a better way to punch through a Panther tank's hide in 1942. The Americans had the bazooka, and the Germans had the Panzerschreck, both of which used rockets. Britain, however, was playing a different game. They were looking for a way to deliver a heavy-shaped charge without the massive backblast of a rocket, which would give away a soldier's position in the tight hedgerows of Europe or the rubble of an Italian town. The result was the PIAT, crude, violent, and notoriously difficult to master. It was a machine built by men who knew they were outgunned, and it was carried by men who were expected to perform the impossible. Before the mud of the Savio takes hold, welcome back. We are timeless arms. We're here for the history the textbooks ignore, the grit, the steel, and the souls who held the line. We need to hit our subscriber goals to keep this research moving, so if you value the unvarnished truth of the battlefield, hit that subscribe button now and join the Timeless Arms family. Help us keep these stories from fading into the fog. To understand the PIAT, you have to understand the sheer physical struggle of using it. This wasn't a weapon you just picked up. It was a weapon you wrestled with. The core of the PIAT was the spigot mortar principle, a concept that feels ancient compared to the jet-age technology that was emerging at the time. Instead of a traditional barrel that contained an explosion to propel a projectile, the PIAT used a heavy steel rod, known as the spigot, surrounded by a massive high-tension spring. This spring was the literal heart of the weapon. It was made of high-grade steel, coiled with such tension that it was a danger to the user even when it wasn't being fired. The engineering was led by Major Millis Jeffress and Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, two men who worked for Churchill's toy shop, the department responsible for the weird weapons of the war. They knew that a rocket was a complex piece of chemistry, and in the early 1940s, British rocket tech was unreliable and produced a massive, blinding flash. But a spring? A spring was simple physics, or at least it was supposed to be. In reality, the spring in the PIAT was so powerful that it required 200 pounds of force to cock. This wasn't a job for the weak of heart or the light of frame. It was a mechanical nightmare that required a soldier to put his entire body weight into the struggle. To cock the weapon, a soldier had to lie on his back, place both feet on the reinforced shoulder pad, grab the trigger guard with both hands, and pull with every muscle in his legs, back, and arms until the mechanism clicked into place. This was a visceral, agonizing process. If your hands were wet with the rain of Italy, or if your boots slipped on the mud, the weapon remained uncocked. Worse yet, if you slipped mid-pull, the spring could snap back with enough force to shatter your ribs or break your wrists. It was a physical testament to the grit of the men who carried it. They didn't just fire the PIAT, they survived the act of preparing it. When you pulled the trigger, that massive spring slammed the spigot forward. The spigot would enter a hollow tube in the rear of the bomb, striking a percussion cap that ignited a small propellant charge. This explosion didn't happen inside a barrel. It happened inside the tail of the projectile itself. The explosion threw the bomb forward while simultaneously pushing the spigot back, which was supposed to recock the spring for the next shot. This was the blowback principle at its most violent. If everything went perfectly, if the propellant charge burned exactly right and the shooter held the weapon firmly, the bolt would fly back and lock. But in the chaos of a firefight, perfect was a rare luxury. If the soldier didn't brace the PIAT correctly, the recoil would be absorbed by his body rather than the mechanism, and the spring would stay forward. This left the soldier in a deadly predicament. He had to perform that agonizing, back-breaking cocking procedure all over again, often while a tank was actively searching for his position. The recoil itself was legendary. The canvas pad on the stock was often stuffed with horsehair or thick wool, but it did little to soften the blow. Many PIAT gunners suffered from chronic shoulder bruising or even dislocated collarbones. It was a weapon that demanded a blood sacrifice every time it was used. But let's talk about the payoff. Let's talk about what happened when that bomb actually hit. The PIAT fired a 3-pound projectile that looked like an oversized lawn dart. The front of the bomb was a hollowed-out cup filled with high explosives, utilizing the Monroe effect, the principle of a shaped charge. When the nose of the bomb struck armor, the explosive detonated from the rear, collapsing a copper cone inside into a superheated, hypersonic jet of molten metal. This jet traveled at speeds of up to 8 kilometers per second, burning a hole through up to 4 inches of solid Krupp steel. It didn't rely on velocity or kinetic energy. It relied on the terrifying science of directed energy. This meant the PIAT could kill a Panther or a Tiger tank just as effectively at 100 yards as it could at 10 yards. However, getting it to hit at 100 yards was the real challenge. Because the projectile was launched by a spring and a small charge, it had a very low muzzle velocity, about 250 feet per second. For comparison, a modern handgun bullet travels 4 times that fast. The PIAT bomb traveled in a high, looping arc, much like a lobbed football. The sights were crude, folding pieces of metal with 3 apertures for different ranges. To hit a moving target, you had to lead the tank by a significant margin and account for a massive amount of drop. One of the most unique and terrifying features of the PIAT was its lack of signature. Because there was no rocket motor burning behind the projectile, there was no smoke trail and no muzzle flash. A PIAT gunner could fire from inside a building or a dense hedgerow without setting the room on fire or giving away his position to every sniper in the area. All the enemy would hear was a metallic clunk, followed by the shriek of the bomb, and then, hopefully, the roar of an exploding tank. It was a silent assassin in a world of thunder. But that silence was only useful if the gunner had the nerves of an ice carver, because to get a hit, you had to wait. You couldn't fire the PIAT from a distance and hope for the best. You had to let the tank get close. You had to wait until the ground was shaking and the smell of diesel was thick in the air. You had to ignore the secondary armament of the tank, the MG-34s and MG-42s that were raking the bushes looking for you. You had to wait until you could see the individual bolts on the tank's turret. It was a game of chicken played with 40 tons of steel, and the only card you had to play was a spring-loaded pipe that might not even recock itself. This was the world of Private Ernest Smokey Smith. Smokey wasn't a man who cared about the theoretical Monroe effect or the metallurgy of the spigot. He was a man from the rugged wilderness of British Columbia, a member of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. He was a man who lived by his own rules, a troublemaker who had been promoted to corporal 9 times and demoted back to private 9 times. He was a man who didn't respect authority, but he respected the job that needed to be done. He understood the PIAT better than the men who designed it. He knew its weight, its violent kick, and its limitations. As we move into the second part of this story, we are going to see how this troublemaker used this ugly weapon to hold back a German armored column and earn the highest honor his country could give. The date was October 21st, 1944. The place was the northern bank of the Savio River in Italy. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and the sharp, metallic tang of cordite. The rain wasn't just falling. It was a relentless grey curtain that turned the world into a slurry of deep, sucking mud. The Canadian Army had managed to establish a small, precarious bridgehead across the river, but the weather had betrayed them. The rising waters had washed out the temporary bridges behind them, leaving the infantry of the Seaforth Highlanders isolated on the far bank. They had no tanks. They had no anti-tank guns. They had no hope of reinforcement until the waters receded. They were alone in the dark, and they knew the Germans were coming for them. In this moment, the only thing standing between the Canadian bridgehead and total annihilation was a handful of men armed with a weapon that most soldiers considered a mechanical joke. The German command knew the Canadians were vulnerable. They launched a counterattack led by the 26th Panzer Division, a unit that knew how to use armor in the tight, difficult terrain of Italy. Out of the gloom and the roar of the rain, a new sound began to emerge. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping, a vibration that traveled through the mud and into the bones of the men waiting in the ditches. It was the sound of Maybach HL-230 engines. A column of German Panther tanks and self-propelled guns was moving down the road toward the bridgehead, supported by a company of battle-hardened paratroopers. The Panther was the apex predator of the Italian campaign, 45 tons of sloped armor and a 75mm gun that could pick off a target from 2 miles away. In the dark, they looked like prehistoric monsters rising from the Italian soil. Against this mechanical tide, the Canadians had only their courage and a handful of PIATs. Smokey Smith was positioned in a shallow ditch alongside the main road leading to the crossing. As the German column approached, the rest of his platoon platoon was forced back by an intense hail of machine gun and mortar fire. The Panther tanks were spraying everything in sight, their long 7.5-centimeter guns occasionally barking as they fired into suspected positions. Most men would have retreated. Most men would have sought the safety of the rear. But Smokey Smith made a choice that defies conventional military logic. He grabbed his 32-pound PIAT and began to crawl forward, deeper into the kill zone. He wasn't just moving, he was hunting. He dragged that heavy steel tube through the freezing muck, ignoring the shards of shrapnel that were whistling over his head like angry hornets. He knew the PIAT was useless at long range. At 50 yards, the accuracy was questionable. At 100 yards, it was a gamble. To kill a panther, Smokey knew he had to get so close that he could hear the crew's breathing. He reached a spot just 30 feet from the road. Let that sink in for a moment. 30 feet. That is the distance of 2 cars parked end to end. At that range, the Panther tank looked like a mountain of steel, its tracks churning up geysers of mud that coated Smokey as he lay in the ditch. He could hear the squeal of the bogie wheels and the heavy metallic clatter of the tracks as they crushed the stone of the road, and he stayed low, his heart beating in sync with the rumble of the engine. He waited until the leading Panther was directly in front of him, its massive gun barrel passing just feet above his head. He sighted down the crude metal apertures of the PIAT, braced the canvas pad against his shoulder with a grip that would have crushed bone, and pulled the trigger. The metallic clunk of the spring was buried by the roar of the detonation. The PIAT bomb struck the side of the Panther with a blinding flash of white and orange. The shape charge did exactly what it was designed to do. It burned a hole through the armor and ignited the ammunition inside. The interior of the tank became a furnace of molten copper and exploding shells. The Panther erupted in a geyser of sparks and smoke, its tracks grinding to a halt as the crew scrambled to escape the burning hull. But the battle was far from over. The German paratroopers who had been riding on the back of the tank jumped off and swarmed Smokey's position. They came at him with grenades and MP-40 submachine guns, spraying the ditch with lead. Smokey was hit in the leg, but he didn't even flinch. He dropped the empty PIAT, grabbed his Thompson submachine gun, and stood up in the mud. He began to clear the ditch with a cold, focused fury, killing 4 of the enemy at point-blank range and forcing the rest to retreat into the darkness. He wasn't just a soldier in that moment. He was a wall of defiance. When a second tank moved up to bypass the burning wreck of the first, Smokey didn't run. He sat back down in the mud, grabbed another 3-pound PIAT bomb, and began the agonizing process of recocking the spring. Imagine the strength it took to pull that 200-pound spring while wounded in the leg and under fire. He put his feet on the pad, pulled with every ounce of his remaining strength, and felt the mechanism lock. He loaded the second bomb and waited. The second tank, seeing the fate of the first and the man standing in the mud, hesitated. Its crew saw the silhouette of the giant slayer in the ditch and decided they had seen enough. They began to reverse, their machine guns raking the ground around Smokey. He had held the road, he had fought a tank duel on foot, and he had won. Smokey Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions that night. He was the only Canadian private to receive the VC during the entire Second World War. When he went to London to receive the medal from King George VI, the army had to keep a close eye on him. He was still the same troublemaker he had always been. There are stories that they actually had to put him in a holding cell the night before the ceremony, just to make sure he showed up sober and with all his buttons polished. But that was Smokey. He wasn't a man built for parades. He was a man built for the mud and the dark. When asked about his heroics later in life, he famously brushed it off, saying he just didn't want the Germans to get to the bridge. He saw it as a job, a messy, violent job that required a messy, violent tool. The PIAT would eventually be replaced by more modern systems like the bazooka and the Carl Gustav, but it remains a symbol of a time when the British Empire had to innovate with whatever they had on hand. It was a weapon of mechanical contradictions, too heavy, too short-ranged, and too violent, but in the hands of a man who refused to move, it was enough to change the course of a war. It was the ultimate ugly weapon for the ultimate ugly fight. At Timeless Arms, we find the soul inside the steel. We are here to make sure these stories of grit and unconventional engineering are never forgotten. We believe that history isn't just about the winners, it's about the tools they used and the price they paid to use them. Now I want to hear from you. We are Timeless Arms, and we want to know, if you were standing on that riverbank in the rain with a wounded leg and a Panther tank 30 feet away, would you have the physical strength to cock that spring? Do you think the PIAT was a brilliant piece of outside-the-box engineering? Or was it a dangerous relic that should have been replaced much sooner? How do you think modern anti-tank warfare compares to the raw, visceral experience of the spigot mortar? And for our Canadian and UK viewers, do we do enough today to remember the troublemakers like Smokey Smith, who saved the day when the professionals were pushed back? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights are what make this community the best on the platform. We are pushing hard for our subscriber goals to keep these hero stories moving forward. If you haven't joined the ranks yet, hit that subscribe button and stand with us as we uncover the stories the textbooks forgot. We need your voice and your support to keep the mission alive. Thank you for being part of the journey. Every comment and every new subscriber helps us reach the next chapter of this journey. Until next time, this is Timeless Arms.